Hi everybody. So today what we're going to be doing is talking a little bit about the Cosecha Principles, which are essentially the tools that cosecheros and cosecheras have in order to be able to protect our movement. So just a quick overview. We're going to talk first about the training function. So what's the purpose of this training? Then I'll be modeling a presentation that you would be doing in front of a group of future cosecheros and cosecheras at an initiation training, and then together we can review some of the training notes and just a few pointers. So the purpose of this training is that we want future cosecheros and cosecheras in the training to be able to come into the cosecha principles. So in order to be able to do that, of course, we need to understand why we have principles in the first place, why they're important, and also to review them together so that everybody has an understanding of the different principles. So I want to tell you all a little bit about myself and why it is that the principles are important to me. So my name is Vera, and I'm organized in New Jersey. I'm originally from New York. And in 2013, I was part of fighting for the in-state tuition campaign for New Jersey Dreamers. So we were fighting so that immigrant youth could get access to state financial aid and in-state tuition. And it ended up being, well, we ended up having in the fall of 2013 a victory, so the bill was passed into law. The in-state tuition piece was passed, the state financial aid piece was vetoed by Governor Christie at the time, but the Assembly and the Senate still passed that part through. So I've been a part of a lot of different campaigns, and in general, I think the tough times when you lose can be like a real test of what's the strength of the community that you have and the strength of the support systems that you have. So if in those moments when you lose, you have a group of people around you to kind of hold you and help support each other, then I think that really speaks to the strength of the community that you've built. And then, of course, in times of victory, when you win a campaign, those are really exciting. The funny thing about when we won the in-state tuition bill in 2013 was that in some ways it felt exciting, of course. We're like an instrumental part in passing a state bill into law. But on the other hand, a lot of us came away not feeling very good. And as we kind of reflected on what that was about, I think that was I think it kind of speaks to the sort of culture that we had created in our movement, and to a lot of hurt that people feel, that I think having these principles that Cosecha has could have avoided. So we had in the in-state tuition campaign, like a lot of different campaigns do, an inside game and an outside game. So the inside group who are speaking with legislators, and then the outside group who are doing public actions and that kind of thing. And I remember during the campaign, there was a member of our group who was always wanting to do more and more actions. And there really wasn't space for him. It just felt like the inside piece of the campaign, the talking to legislators and all of that, developing relationships with especially people in the Democratic Party, was like really valued above doing the public actions. And I think that he in particular, but actually a lot of us who were much more focused on how do we organize our community, and how do we do public actions, and who wanted to think about escalating, really didn't have a voice in the decision making of the campaign, which led to a lot of tension and led to a lot of feelings of hurt. And then the other piece of it was that a lot of the relationships that were held with allies, with people with elected officials, were really held by a small number of people. And what ended up happening is um, because the campaign was such an inside campaign, because the focus was so much about building relationships with elected officials and kind of taking our cues from them, was that the people who were having those relationships and were having those conversations with legislators ended up having an outsized voice in the campaign, which really made it very difficult for new people who were coming in to take initiative, to take leadership, and to feel valued. So, a long story short, the last day of the campaign, essentially, when the in-state tuition bill was voted into law, we came in thinking that we would have a lot of time to be able to continue to push for state aid. We thought that Governor Christie would take a couple weeks to veto the bill, and that in that time we could do actions to kind of continue momentum for a state financial aid campaign in the coming year. We ended up hearing that morning that we were supposed to be part of a press conference, and the press conference, which we thought would just be about, talking about how the New Jersey Dream Act with in-state tuition and state financial aid was going to be passed. It ended up being a press conference with a set of Democratic leadership in the Senate and Assembly, basically saying that they were going to compromise, that it was a big victory to have in-state tuition passed, even if the governor was going to veto it. And we were sort of put in a position where we were standing up there applauding them, when we'd wished that when what we really wanted to do was do actions and talk about the fact that many people still would not be able to continue to go to school. And I think kind of coming out of that, a lot of people felt like they hadn't had a voice in what the tone was going to be of the press conference, that they wouldn't have wanted to stand there with Democratic elected officials that through the campaign we built relationships with, if they knew that it was basically going to be announcing this compromise between the governor and the Senate and Assembly leadership, who were Democrats. So it was really in that moment, I think, that that all of these feelings that people had been feeling for a while, of not feeling like they had a voice, of feeling like we were much too focused on legislative relationships, that all of that really bubbled up. So we ended up, I think, partly because we developed, we had a real feeling of power, that we had created something good together, decided to work through a lot of those tensions, but it really took us like a year after the in-state tuition victory in order to really be able to work together, and we spent that time kind of healing, and thinking together about what are the principles that that are going to shape the way that we as a group operate. What are our values? What's our way of thinking about the world and thinking about how change happens? We had to process and have a lot of those conversations in order to be able to get to a place where it felt like the group was healthy enough to be able to keep going, and where people felt heard and listened to. So the thing about that I slowly realized after that campaign was that story of this tension between between how close of relationships you're developing with elected officials, tensions about who's getting recognition, and who's making leadership decisions. None of that was unique to the campaign that we were fighting. So actually, it's in many ways as the story of the immigrant rights movement, is tensions around that, and of many different movements. So the good news is that we can actually learn from different movements and be able to work in Cosecha to protect ourselves from having some of those problems arise. And that's really what the principles are about. So just to kind of go over it, the principles that we have exist for the purpose of keeping our movement culture healthy, so that everybody feels heard and listened to, and valued, and accountable and all of those good things. And because there's so much freedom in Cosecha, because there's not one person who's going around and telling villages what they can and can't do and giving them instructions, it's important for everybody to be able to know what are the guidelines. So basically in Cosecha, the rule is that you can do anything you want as long as it falls within the principles, as long as you're honoring them. So any action is a go, you don't have to ask for permission as long as it falls within the different principles. I guess kind of like related to that is that we want to empower everybody in Cosecha to have the basic guidelines, the principles that they need in order to be able to protect the movement. So we're going to review the principles together. So I'd like everybody to get into circles, your circles that you have been meeting with since the beginning of the training. And then we're going to take 10 minutes to read the principles and then discuss them in groups. And then just report back to the larger group on any key takeaways, any principles that speak to you, or any questions that you have. And then I've included here, for the purposes of the Train the Trainers, a list of the different Cosecha principles. This is the shortened version. So when you do the principles, I would suggest passing out the full principles to the people in their groups, but then asking them just to read aloud for everybody the first line. So you can ask them sort of in order, or for volunteers to read Principle 1, monkey see, monkey do. Principle 2, we're all a family. Principle 3, there's no cover for this party, etc. And then I would encourage them to each talk in their small groups about the different principles. So the next couple slides are just a list of the different principles, and this is the shortened version, which you can also find on the Cosecha pamphlets. Okay, so now I'd like to open it up to any questions that people have, and also comments if there is a principle in particular that spoke to you. Now you can give people a little bit of time to talk. I wouldn't let it go over 10 minutes of conversation. Great. So now what we're going to do to get a little bit more familiar with the principles is an activity to act it out. So divide back up into your circles, and I'd like each of you to select a principle. Take 10 minutes together to prepare about a 5-minute skit or a little bit less to act out the principles, and you want it to be well acted out so that the other teams can guess which your principle is. Does that sound good? Yay, okay. Once you do this activity is a fun activity for people to do, and people get into it. At the end of that, you can just open it up to any final questions and thoughts, and then move on to your next activity. So just a few notes before we end. When you're thinking about the story that you want to tell, ideally you can share an organizing experience that you've had within the immigrant rights movements that speaks to the importance of having principles, or if there's one particular principle that you connect with, you can talk about that. So if the nonviolence principle speaks to you and you have a story that you can relate to that, if the we don't dance with political parties principle speaks to you and you have a story that you can talk about that sort of relates to that, then you should go ahead and do that. If there's not a particular story if there's not like a story or experience that speaks to you, then I would just talk kind of more generally about what you could skip that part and talk more generally about what the importance is of principles. I'd also say that when you're doing the storytelling piece and talking about why the principles are important, I'd emphasize that there are a lot of different movements that struggle with similar problems. So the purpose of this training isn't just to talk smack about movements that you've been a part of, or everybody complain about the immigrant rights movement, right? That's not the tone we want to set. I think I would emphasize that there are a lot of movements that have experienced similar issues, and we want to learn from our own history in the immigrant rights movement and from the history of other movements in order to be able to protect Cosecha. Um, yeah. Then when people circle up and come back into groups and ask questions, something that I've found helpful is if there's still some confusion about the purpose of the principles and about what it means for everybody to be a guardian of the movement. There's an example that that's really helpful from the Indian independence movement. So in that movement, which was about liberating India from British rule, Gandhi, of course, is like the famous figurehead there. There was a deep commitment during the Indian independence movement to nonviolence, partly which came from Gandhi's spiritual practice, but it was also a strategic principle, right? They chose to use nonviolence for strategic reasons as well. But during that movement, whenever anybody would start to escalate or get violent, everybody across the whole movement had like internalized as part of the basic core DNA of the movement. Everybody knew a particular song, and when somebody would see at a march that someone was getting violent or escalating, everybody would start to sing that song and crowd towards that person and begin to de-escalate the situation. And so if you heard one person singing it, you would know to start singing that song as well. And so that's a kind of principle that they used and a practice in order to be able to protect the movement from turning nonviolent, which happens in a lot of different movements. I'd also say, too, especially if there are questions about kind of, if there's pushback on on agreeing to a set of principles, I think something that you can say is that all organizations have cultures, but a lot of times those cultures are not made explicit. So people have theories of change, people have ways of relating to political parties, people have different roles, different ways of relating to leaders. People have different ways of relating to fundraising and resources in a movement. All of those different kinds of cultures and politics exist, but they're not always made explicit. And what we're trying to, and sometimes they just develop without people really thinking about it in advance or meaning to. Things, just different ways of doing things and thinking about things kind of arise. And so what we're trying to do with these principles is to be intentional about the culture we're creating. So people spent a lot of time thinking before launching Cosecha about the kind of movement that we wanted to create, and these principles exist really in order to be very upfront about what the culture of the movement is, and make sure that different people are honoring that, if in case that's helpful. And then just another pointer. So when you're having people divide up into groups, I would recommend, in order to act it out, I would recommend that you give them, depending on the number of groups that you have, but I recommend that you give them 3 or 4 principles to choose from. That way they still have some choice in the principle, but also we make sure that not every group picks the same principle. And then make sure that when people are doing the kind of acting it out, it's your role as a trainer and a facilitator to go around to the different circles, listen in, make sure that they're staying on task, make sure that there aren't any questions or that there's no confusion, and then also give them give them a time check so that they don't spend all their time debating which principle they're going to do and then don't actually prepare their skit. And then the skit should take about 5 minutes each. That's something that probably you as a group, when you're when you look at your turnout and when you're planning your training out, with the rest of the training team, you should, you can decide how long you want to make your skits. So you can kind of do the math. If there are 5 teams, if there are 5 different circles, 5 minutes might be too long. So, kind of do it based on that. And that concludes our training. Thank you so much, everybody, and good luck.